So, Sharon, thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful, warm introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I'm on Alive in Tel Aviv on Tuesday. Still, jet lag remains, but I'm so happy to talk to all of you. And thank you very much, Gabi and Hava and all of people, and introduce me and arrange everything to Alive at the Tel Aviv. Thank you so much. Okay, so I don't know how many people, how many audience attend the workshop in yesterday, and my first topic is more simple. More simple. Don't worry, it's very simple. Okay, our job as an analyst to make sense of our patient anguish. Okay, look for. Sorry, just let me do.
You want to close it? Just a second.
Okay.
רק צריך לבקש, הייתה אומרת סבתא שלי.
Okay, let's go. Our job as an analyst to make sense of our patient anguish and look for a way to make their minds more peaceful and fulfilled. Despite the different theoretical models, we cannot deny all of us to greater or lesser degree have a wish to change our patient for the better. But how seriously do we consider the impact of our personal and cultural biases? How aware are we of the risk we run of harming a patient as we go about our work? I'm often aware of a sense of superiority and just as often a sense of inferiority in the psychoanalysts as they talk about their patients. Sometimes it seems that the therapist, myself included, manifest feelings of overpowering strengths and sometimes vulnerability and fear. Ethical training in the psychoanalysis call upon us to become conscious of how positively and negatively our minds affect our patients. In this trend, we are required to continually ask ourselves how we can authentically respond to the call from suffering patients. Such authenticity requires that we be aware of our submission within particular cultural, historical, and social context, and recognize our capability to victimize the very patient we worked for. This awareness is not easy, however, because we typically insist that others view the world through our cultural, historical, and social lens. This is simply an aspect of our humanity. If a patient complains, "I am preoccupied with irrational thought," we immediately think, okay, it's my job to make your mind function properly. I will help you feel at ease and make you more mature. Even in this short discourse, we already bring our sense of what easiness and maturity consists of, takes it for granted that the patient seeks the same goal. When we meet and want to understand others, something not ourselves, for the better or worse, we look into the wish to objectify, represent, abstract them based on our own sense of values. Therapists who work on issues surrounding power imbalances, particularly from the perspectives of feminism, queer theories, post-colonial studies, indicate that one of our most fundamental, inescapable predisposition is to find others' cultures and values awkward, and to objectify and demonize those ways of being. The result is that we seek to conquer and destroy, enlighten, or dominate them. Even American feminine namesake of Amerigo Vespucci was objectified and abstracted by European as the virgin soil longing to be raped by a male. Colonial dominations often came cloaked in the values of justice and compassion. Theorists writing about colonialism and post-colonialism suggest that the dominant powers, Europeans in the Great Shipping Era, Japanese during the Pacific War, Americans in the recent era of globalization, all had a tendency to see themselves as right, mature, superior, and healthy, and anyone not themselves as wrong, immature, inferior, and pathological. Concurring and dominating the other is thus characterized as an effort to educate and change their values and cultures. When our values or cultures are challenged by the encounter with those not ourselves, we cannot escape seeing anything which does not fit within our worldview as a strange or inferior and responded by colonizing. As if to say, I am here to help you mature. I can make you happier. Edward Said, a pioneer of post-colonial critics, in his famous book, Orientalism, argued that the geographic concept of the Orient and the conceptual people, Orientalists, have been created by Orientalists in the West, independent of real lives Arab people in the Middle and Near East. He claimed that these concepts have been psychologically and politically used by the Westerners in order to assert their own right to dominate and colonize Orient by denying and isolating real Orientals' lives as others. In this context, Said said Oriental is seen in opposition to Westerners, and it's a compound of strange, inferior, degenerate, eccentric, and sexual, often feminine. I skip the part. I skip a little bit, okay? It might be said that the therapists exhibit similar desire to colonize their patients. A desire that's in, yeah, skip that.
Yeah, I'm looking for it.
Okay, it's this part. Okay, right. Let's restart again. It might be said that therapists exhibit a similar desire to colonize their patients, desire that's inevitably unfolds in the intersubjective field. Two very, very short case vignettes, which will be explored in more detail later on, are good examples. One describes a female in her 30s, Lily, it's Japanese, who clearly expressed a desire to live by herself for the rest of her life. She maintained that she could engage in sexual relationships, but she was not willing to enter an emotional, intimate relationship. She said that she did not see herself as being in need of therapy or needing to change, and came to see me to help her realize her wish to live by herself without emotionally intimate relationships. When I heard her self-description in our first session, I found myself automatically establishing the therapeutic goal of having her find intimacy. A second vignette examines a gay male, Ken, Japanese too, who claimed that his homosexuality was an illness to be cured. In our work, while I believe that my job was to respect his own way of understanding himself, I found a small piece of me within with an urge to educate him from contemporary psychological standards and convince him that his view was wrong. The exploration of these vignettes begins with the discussion of the first issues, the therapist's inherent wish to dominate, enlighten our patients, and how this wish arises from our vulnerability, just as many colonial powers began as colonies themselves, or had reasons to fear being colonized. The United States of America began as a federation of colonies, gradually displacing indigenous residents Japan witnessed China colonized by various Western countries. So too, a therapist colonizes vulnerable or fearful people, victims as well as victimizers. This leads to the second issue, the ultimate impossibility of a therapist wholly dominating and controlling their patient's mind. Again, the comparison to relationship between coronial powers and subject elucidates the question at hand. Homi Bhabha, as a post-coronial theorist, criticizes Said's account by saying there is always a suggestion that the coronial power and discourse is possessed entirely by colonizers, and expand Said's perspective to discuss why the effort of orientalizing is destined to fail. Thank you. Bhabha referred to the daft example in which the words of a Christian preacher in India were transferred and understood by indigenous people in the form of a teaching of their traditional religions. He says, let's skip the point again. Okay. Bhabha introduces two concepts, ambivalence of mimicry and hybridity of coronial discourse, that help us to understand why the coronial project cannot be completed. Ambivalence of mimicry refers to the psychological and linguistic process in which the visual difference, they were not white people, is easily converted to the sign of threat to the dominance. By mimicry of colonizers, indigenous people who learned to manage colonizers' language and were well educated in colonizers' values, a people almost the same but not quite white, who may defy colonizers' orders using newly acquired language and values. Hybridity of coronial discourse referred to the impossibility of maintaining the pure discourse of colonizers in the colonized, as shown in the example of the deaf missionaries' experience. Similarly, therapist discourse can never be perfectly internalized in the patient's minds in its pure form. Patients who themselves adopt the therapist discourse use it for their own purpose and not controlled by the therapist language. Finally, we come to third issue, therapist inevitable deceptions of themselves and others regarding the treatment of their patients. Therapists maintain that they are working for their patients in the hope that they can successfully produce healthier minds as they understand those outcomes. But someone who tries to change others often say that they are doing it for the sake of the one who must undergo the change. Said pointed out this kind of deceptive discourse in the June 30, 1910 speech by Arthur James Balfour, a former Prime Minister of Great Britain. Is it a good thing for these great nations, it means British colonies like Egypt, I admit their greatness, that this absolute government should be exercised by us? I think it is a good thing. I think that experience shows that they have got under its far better government than in the whole history of the world they ever had before, and which not only in the benefit to them, but is undoubtedly at a benefit to whole of the civilized West. The great nations in this text refer to the people of the British colonies like Egypt. In this statement, Balfour implicitly and explicitly claimed Britain colonized these nations in order to raise them from barbaric to civilized state and make their lives better. Colonizers attempt to trick the colonized into becoming co-conspirations by asserting, you want to be educated. You know you need help. You long for our guidance. How much more so our patient driven to the complicit in the intersubjective arena. In this presentation, I will explore how colonizer and the colonizer relationship is created in the intersubjective field, and how therapists can work therapeutically and ethically in this field. The therapist's desire to colonize the patient is seen as everyday therapeutic dialogue in our daily practices. Example is a lady, the female patient in her 30s. She was cheerful and friendly, with many acquaintances, mostly conducted online. Lady preferred not to be around people, nor did she seek to establish close relationship. Only superficial relationships, including sexual relationships without commitment, were acceptable to her. She knew men who wished to be romantically involved with her, but she avoided developing relationship with them, citing two reasons. First, she was afraid of being emotionally dependent on a man and then being abandoned by him. Second, she feared being dependent on and holding herself responsible for her partner's emotional world. She was not willing to get married and have babies. She insisted that socializing with her was a waste of time for these men because it would inevitably be dead-end relationship. Yet she did not want to live by herself for the rest of her life and experience occasional sexual desire. She wished to have a man who she liked and who understood her desire for sexual involvement without intimacy. Maybe I'm sorry. Could you pass the water? Lady said that these wishes had to do with the bad relationship between her parents. Her father was rarely at home and her mother frequently complained about him. When her father did return to their home after long absence, Lady was afraid of losing him again and to care for her mother, who was upset by father's constant returning and leaving. I assume that most experienced psychotherapists have seen or heard about this type of patient, pretty popular. You would see this patient complain as a problem with attachment and or intimacy or whatever, derived from a disappointment with her caregivers. Initially, I followed that line as well. Probably this understanding was not completely off the mark. In my mind, I set a goal of the working through a rested longing for the intimacy and attachment, making it possible for her to have rich emotional and intimate relationships with others. I believe most clinicians in similar circumstances would proceed along similar lines. Clinicians offering this goal to their patient could expect the patient to agree with them. And if the patient says, "You're right, but I do not think that I can achieve the goal," therapists would understand this as evidence of arrested motivation or resistance for better health and a firmer enactment in the therapeutic dialogue. This is how I thought about Lily, but I missed the important point, which was that my patient never said that she wanted to change herself, but insisted that she accepted herself as she was. It is not the point of the argument whether my psychological assessment or understanding is valid or not. The important point is how my own values are brought into the therapeutic dialogue and how ladies' own values are ignored. In a case like this, it is not easy for clinicians to be cautious about imposing their own values. The patient culture and values are easily ignored, overwhelmed by the therapeutic goal of her having intimate relationship, a goal that would almost invariably be seen as a healthy way of living in our culture. The therapeutic goal would not be considered potential invasion of patient's mind. Rather, in this case, the patient's beliefs and values would be seen as authority and would be expected to transform to align with the norm of the culture the clinicians either personally, professionally embedded into. The prevailing attitudes among therapists is that being intimate with others is good and avoiding intimacy is wrong. The sex combined with the wish to avoid developing intimate relationship is attachment issue at odds with accepted cultural values. Given this context, neither patient nor therapist would be likely to see the therapeutic goal as merely embedded in a certain culture, or that such healthy idea might itself be injurious to the patient. The therapist's intervention based on this cultural value would be seen as an innocent and appropriate. But as long as the therapist believes that they need to change the patient's mind and transform the alterity of her values to, in effect, enlighten her, it is no less than colonization. There are many people who avoid developing intimate relationships with the opposite sex. Some actively seek to do so, some do so reluctantly. Some feel it as a psychological problem, some do not. But who can say that this lifestyle is good or not, of greater or lesser degree value? In my understanding, we can neither say that it is immature, wrong, or pathological, nor can we say that it is mature, good, and healthy. If we are preoccupied with identifying the good and the bad, we dramatically divide the word by naming it. Of course, some patients may claim that they want to cure or change themselves. They may say that their current lives are far from what they want. In this case, of course, one of the aim of job would be address their wish as an issue to work through and help a patient to find good way to change themselves. However, helping a patient reach their goal is obviously not the same as thinking their current lifestyle is inferior or immature, nor is it an attempt to change them to conform with our own wishes. As Said suggests, they are inferior and we need to educate them is the very essence of colonization. I will conquer your land and enlighten you with the more correct contemporary ideas because you, savaged, are in need of a modern civilization. The self-serving position is captures in psychological term in the Falanges confusions of tongues. A parent reads natural and ordinary love for their child shows for them that the child wished to be seduced and sexually conquered by the parents. Such a rationalize their sexual abuse. Similarly, when patients seek your help, it does not mean that they are authorizing you to change their worldview to yours, to dye them in your hue, in Japanese phrase. Analytic colonization is also an example of the impossibility of informed consent. Abusing parents may claim that their actions are consensus-based consensus-based because they inform the child that their behavior is an expression of true love, and the child gives consent. Still, an action cannot be justified. Similarly, if you tell your patient, I am indoctrinating you with my own ideas because I know that you need help. I do it with compassion, and I am genuinely working for your good. And your patient gives consent. The inaction still cannot be justified. The action is still imperialist, ceding of psychological territory under the auspices of legitimizing, but coring a treaty. This is not to say that we should help this type of patient avoiding developing intimate relationships, nor should we stop helping the patient have a sense of intimacy, as he or she wants. There is no doubt that most therapists, including myself, would aim to help our patients have rich and stable relationship with others. And I believe that most of patients would concur. But aren't these intentions coached within attitudes, acknowledged or not? That I have to give my immature patient the gift of my superior insights. And if these attitudes make its presence felt in the therapeutic dialogue, isn't it justified? If wishing to avoid developing intimate relationship is a issue of attachment and intimacy, then wishing to have intimate relationships with others also an issue of attachment and or intimacy. The first one is seen as an issue to be cured, however, why the second one is not. In that scenario, the patient and therapist might discuss how the patient can achieve the balance between his or her career and a private life. But therapists would not say that there is a pathological aspect in the patient thinking. For wishing to have an intimate relationship is an issue of attachment and intimacy that is perfectly fitted to the culture we are currently embedded in. In such case, neither therapist nor patient takes into account the possibility that the body might be seen as alien and pathological at another time. Only 40 years ago, the discussion as to whether homosexuality was a psychiatric illness was not clearly settled. If clinicians in those days saw the patient who claimed that he or she was homosexual, some might have automatically diagnosed it as psychological problem and believe it was an issue to be cured. Today, there is no question that would constitute the therapist colonizing subjectivity of his or her patient, and it's impossible to tell how, in 50 years' time, clinicians may see these cases. Clinicians no longer view LGBTQ identification as a set of issues to be cured, but rather seek to educate society to understand them in natural forms and human sexuality. This is my position. I do not see it as a psychiatric or psychological pathology or illness. Rather, I try to focus on my patient pain and anguish about living in this world as a part of a marginalized minority, and I believe that this understanding is right and just. Armed with the mindset, I happened to see Ken, a patient who claimed that his homosexuality was an illness and wanted to fix it. The ghost of the thoughts immediately floated into my mind. I wish to educate and to correct him by saying, no, homosexuality is not illness. Of course, in the main, I wanted and I tried to empathically follow his belief. Still, a small, very small piece of me maintained that his problem was seeing his homosexuality was pathology. This part of me automatically attempted to establish right goals for him, believing that if I could provide him with appropriate education and guidance on contemporary attitudes, he would give up his wrong belief about his homosexuality and accept his sexual orientation. How different was my plan from that of the clinicians 40 years ago who diagnosed homosexuality as an illness. In one sense, I completely different, but it was still colonization. It's not that our understanding of sexual preference has not changed. Only that our understanding is still inescapably dichotomous, in which things that are syntonic to our social, cultural, and historical values are right, and things that are dystonic to them are wrong. This thinking leads to our desire to colonize others. Why do clinicians unknowingly and unthinkingly want to colonize their patients? I discussed the beginning on this paper. Colonizers can themselves be invaded and colonized. Colonizers may also find that they cannot control those who they have colonized and must live in fear of them. To avoid these vulnerabilities, and clinicians colonize their patients in appropriate areas of their values and consciousness. In this section, I will discuss the relationship between patient-therapist from the perspective of colonized interactions. Japan, who invaded Asian countries, just as it had been them invaded by European powers, could not voluntarily withdraw from them, for Japan saw that country that did not have its own colonies would inevitably be a country who could be colonized. It's 100 years ago. And not having colonies meant that Japan was vulnerable. Remember that tonight, going back and forth between Taiwan and Japan, Taiwan used to be the part of Japan. Japan colonized, Taiwan for 80 years. This is the, this experience always, behind my back. So on this discussion. Japan employed delusive sophistry and proclaimed that its conquests were, in fact, for the good and the colonized, and undertaken out of abundance of compassion and goodwill. The conquered people, of course, were not fooled. In judgment of history was that what you claim as love turned out to be violence. Therapists who fear their own vulnerability desire to colonize their patients. They need many patient colonies, patient-colonies, and can never allow them to withdraw, or they must face the fact that they might be colonized by others with alien values. As long as they can see themselves as a people who can enlighten their patients, they can tune out the nagging voice and saying their errors in your thoughts and values. You yourself need to be educated and enlightened. When a patient wants to terminate therapy, we often experience it as a jolt to something essential in our minds. We may want to prevent a patient from leaving and analyze the desire to go as resistance or an enactment. It is not so uncommon for the therapist to cajole their patient who is staying in therapy. Therapists do not want to lose their patient. At least I do not want to. Not only are they narcissistically injured, but they also must face their own radical vulnerability. You have patronized their patient. Now are you ready to be invaded, treated as inferior, foreigners by others? Therapists who are unaware of their vulnerability are forced to deceptive. maintaining, I am colonizing you, but I do it out of love. When I was with my patient who felt his homosexuality was illness and wanted to be cured, I was aware that part of me wanted to educate him that homosexuality was no longer seen as an illness, but as one aspect of individual identity. I said that this was the current psychiatric understanding, but this patient did not agree with this idea, maintained that he wanted me to fix him. He said, I know what current psychiatrists and psychologists think, but I have reached this understanding by studying this issue, very hard on my own. This statement confirmed to me that my job was to give guidance to someone who was misinformed. I gently and carefully went through the history of psychiatry and clinical psychologists' perspectives on the issue of homosexuality, and when I finished, my patient dismissed my explanation, saying, current psychiatry has the wrong idea. This only convinced me further of the rightness of my own viewpoint and led me to continue to attempt to educate him. When I think back, I realize that I wanted to believe that this was evidence of my compassion and kindness towards him. It's my confess. If I could have changed his mind, I would not have engaged in such deceptive discourse. We often try to bend others to our options with the word love or care, whatever, when we find ourselves unable to dominate them. When therapists try to convey the idea which might not necessarily be agreeable to the patient, they say, I think you might want. They do so because they probably feel that framing makes it easier for the patient to accept their ideas. But often, therapists are still unable to change the patient's mind, and they feel frustrated that they cannot control them, or even feel completely alienated from them. In this situation, clinicians have to accept the fact that their ideas are not understood completely, but their notions might be rejected, and that their thinking could be misunderstood forever. They may be injured by the patient who responds, you say, I may want to, but I do not want to. Such words imbalance therapists, confronting them not only with their radical powerlessness and loneliness, but also the crime of attempting to whitewash their deception. Therapists want to maintain a patient colonies forever in order not to look at their own vulnerability. We are injured and wounded enough to be colonized, and we also recognize that we are not powerful enough to dominate our patient. Once we begin to colonize a patient, we are unable to quit, which creates another kind of vulnerability when we are required to take on the role of a colonial master and forced to respond to the demands of our subject. Butler beautifully described the reciprocal vulnerability of a colonizer relationship in her discussion of dependency and obligation. She states, there are forms of colonial power that seek to establish so-called dependency and colonized. And these kinds of arguments seek to make dependency an essential pathological feature of populations. The colonizers, as Memmi has argued, then understands himself as adult in the scene, the one who can bring the colonized population out of their childlike dependency into enlightened adulthood. But truth is, the colonizer depends upon the colonized, but when the colonized refuses to remain subordinate, then the colonizer is threatened with the loss of colonial power. Male patient of mine in the 30s seemed to want to transcribe my thought. He read the books I have written in order to understand my thinking perfectly, and it seemed to me that he wanted to become my clone. Initially, I enjoyed the scene of superiority. However, when he urged me to show him my manuscript in progress and let him know the schedules of all my public speaking and engagement, I turned down his request with a strong sense of guilt. It's a pretty proper Japanese reaction, and attempted to explore the emotional background of his wishes. He was disappointed and complained that I was not acting as ideal therapist that I portrayed in my books and papers. I'm recognized as a pretty, a radical, analyst. He claimed that I should have been more empathic to him and relaxed my mechanical therapeutic attitudes described in several cases in my book. His questioning of my thought and attitudes had a strong impact on me. The patient who believed had begun to share my thoughts turned out not to share my values. Or perhaps he had revealed the dark side of those values, deceptive elements in my discourse. He made me anxious, and I badly wanted to persuade him my behaviors and description in my book were consistent, even if they might look inconsistent. Indeed, I was unable to resist saying, "That's not what I wrote." I did not say the therapist should follow all of their patient requests. He sounded disappointed as he told me, "If that's the case, I would not have believed in you. You deceived me." I recognize that my only options were to insist on my position and the discussion and acquiesce to his request, which might have allowed me to keep the role of his colonial master even as I served him. Therapists who colonized their patients have to render services to them. Therapists who try to conquer their patients are often conquered by them. And therapists who try to exploit are in turn exploited. To avoid their vulnerability, therapists have to be dedicated to their patient. Clinicians cannot escape the temptation to colonize their patient, which is why the clinician's ethical codes and issues warning through two constraints. First, it says that we must not use a patient as an object for our desire. In concrete terms, this is a prohibition against the exploitation of the patient. Second, the code suggests that we not hamper our patient's free will. It is a duty to guarantee the patient freedom of speech and freedom to continue to terminate the therapeutic relationship. But colonizing includes the process of using our patients as an object of desire and a demand to place restrictions on the patient's freedom. The ethical code, which implicitly warned clinicians not to colonize their patients, exposed a vulnerable position that clinicians find themselves in due to asymmetries of therapeutic relationship. The issue of asymmetric relationship in psychoanalysis has been discussed by the many relational and intersubjective analysts. One kind of asymmetry is primarily a therapist over patient. Patients are sufferers, therapists are the people designed to help them. Ironically, this asymmetric relationship often creates an environment for a potentially colonizing relationship. Some may say that the fee patients pay create balance and compensate for the asymmetrical nature of the relationship. Yet it does not prevent a patient from feeling terrified and frightened of our power. Nor does it keep them from being cautious about our authority, just as Asian countries pay to maintain U.S. troops in their land but cannot escape the sense of watchfulness toward Americans' mood. Money does not change the essential relationship in colonizer and colonized. Another kind of asymmetry in the therapeutic relationship is disparity of responsibility. Therapists who are bound to help suffering, injured patient must take responsibility for the relationship, even though their communications are always interactive. Responsibility is not mutual in their discussions. Recent ethical turn in psychoanalysis is based on the principle that therapists cannot escape the call for responsibility when the suffering and injured patient appears in their presence. There is no option other than offering help, regardless of the therapist's state when they see the patient. The responsibility is always on the side of the therapist. Ironically, this moral imperative often creates potentially colonial relationship. The third asymmetry in the therapeutic relationship is organized around what is permissible for the patient but not for the therapist. Therapists are not allowed to thwart the patient's free will, while the therapist's will is restricted. Patients are allowed to say anything about their therapist in any form within the limits of the law, but therapists, with few exceptions, cannot speak about the patient to third party without patient permission. Patients are allowed to stop their therapy whenever they want. The therapists are not always allowed to do so, except under special circumstances. Patients are allowed to see the therapist as an object for their desire. In analysis, which sees the transference analyst as essential action of therapy, patients are actually recommended to do so. Therapists, however, are not allowed to do so. Of course, the therapist cannot escape seeing the patient as an object of desire. Still, they are required to try not to do so. Patients see the therapist in any way they want, as lover, rival, or an object to be destroyed. They also treat the therapist as they see fit. Patients may tell others about what their therapists say, about how they experience their therapist, regardless of whether it is true or not. Clara Thompson, who was Ferencz's patient, trumpeted her personal feelings about him and spoke to many people to the effect that she was allowed to kiss him whenever she wanted. Those assertions were used by some analysts as a way of criticizing, ostracizing Ferenczi, but he did not raise any objection or contradict Thompson. Unlike patient, therapists are not in a position in which they can assert tangible or intangible fact about their patients, nor relate their subjective experience and impressions of their patients. They cannot concur rumors about themselves publicly. They cannot counter rumors about themselves publicly. The therapist-therapeutic relationship is inherently asymmetrical, which put not only patient but also therapist in the vulnerable position. Therapists sooner or later become aware that they are not sufficiently protected. They become aware that they are colonizers as vulnerable as their subjects are. And all colonizers sooner or later recognize that they cannot control the people that they subjugate, complain with the people they occupy. Subjugate follow. Rather, they realize that they are also controlled by, must be compliant with the people they occupy. If they resort to violence, they may be able to escape temporarily, but their crimes or coercion and misrepresentation ultimately puts them in evident more vulnerable position. In conclusion, I maintain the colonizer and colonizer relationship both creates and is created by the essential asymmetry of the therapeutic dialogue. This asymmetry is organized in their dimensions: therapist's primacy over their patients, disparity of responsibility, and therapist restriction versus patient freedom. I argue that each of these dimensions put both therapist and patient in position of vulnerability, and the therapists seek to escape those vulnerability by colonizing their patients. Paradoxically, this context can also make therapists into helpers and healers as long as they recognize their complex position. Do we really know how difficult job we do?